The first warning came as a ripple through quiet space around the Kepri system, a place most galactic charts marked as minor and unimportant, home to a small amphibious species, called a Lirren, who had learned farming, art, and basic orbital travel, but nothing resembling war, and that was exactly why the Zha'thor Armada chose them, because the galaxy had a long tradition of feeding on the weak while congratulating itself for order and balance. And when the Zha'thor fleets aligned there, obsidian hulls, and ignited their drives, their admirals felt no fear, only mild impatience. Because this was supposed to be easy, a quick show of force to claim resources and remind nearby systems who truly rule the outer spiral. And no one in their command chambers gave more than a passing thought to the small blue marker on the diplomatic records that listed the Lirren as protected associates of Earth, because humanity was still new, still quiet, still spoken of in council halls with indulgent smiles and dismissive gestures, a species known more for talk than teeth. And as the Armada advanced, the Lirren watched from their watery cities in terror, while their elders sent desperate signals into the void, not to great federations that had ignored them before, but to the humans, because humans had answered once already when pirates came, had sent engineers instead of soldiers, food instead of threats, and promises instead of contracts, and that signal crossed space fast, slipping past trade lanes and patrol routes, arriving at Earth where it was received not in a grand council chamber, but in a modest operations room where Admiral Sarah Bennett stood with her hands folded behind her back, listening in silence as the Lirren ambassador spoke with a voice that trembled despite every effort at dignity. And when the transmission ended, no one in the room asked whether Earth should respond, because the question had been settled long before by the simple human habit of standing by those who trusted them. And Bennett turned to her staff and said, "Notify Vanguard Command." And with that calm sentence, the machinery of something ancient and carefully restrained began to move, because the human Vanguard was not a fleet meant for parades or posturing. It was a doctrine turned into steel, a response force designed around a single ugly lesson humanity had learned back when it still fought among itself. That deterrence only worked if violence was swift, overwhelming, and final. And within hours, ships that had been drifting silent at the edges of known space changed course, their hulls unadorned, their drives efficient rather than flashy, crews waking from long routines into sharp focus without speeches or cheers, because this was not glory work. This was obligation. And as the Vanguard moved, the Zha'thor Armada entered the Kepri system in textbook formation, projecting power, broadcasting demands, already calculating how the Lirren cities would look once, refitted to Zha'thor needs, unaware that their sensors were already being painted, not aggressively, not yet, but with the cold attention of predators who had learned patience the hard way. And when the first human ship translated into the system far closer than any conventional jump should allow, the Zha'thor commanders laughed, assuming a malfunction or a bluff, until more followed, not clustering, not forming a line, but spreading with deliberate geometry that spoke of rehearsals run 1,000 times. And only then did unease creep into the Armada, a faint sense that something about this encounter was wrong, because the humans did not issue threats or ultimatums. They did not posture or plead. They simply opened a channel, and Admiral Bennett's voice carried across the void, steady and clear, stating that the Lirren were under human protection, that the Zha'thor fleets were to withdraw immediately, and that this was not a negotiation. And for a heartbeat the galaxy seemed to hold its breath, because in that moment the Zha'thor had a choice, and like so many before them, they mistook human restraint for weakness, and chose poorly, firing the first shots, bright lances of energy streaking toward the human ships. And when those shots vanished into layered defensive fields that bent physics just enough to make a point, the human Vanguard responded, not with fury, not with chaos, but with precision, and the opening exchange rewrote every assumption the Zha'thor had ever held about humanity. As their forward cruisers went dark in perfect synchronization, their systems shut down rather than exploded, their crews alive but helpless, drifting, and as panic spread to the Armada, Bennett gave a quiet order, "Advance," and the Vanguard moved like a closing hand, inexorable, controlled, and utterly indifferent to the terror blooming across Zha'thor command channels, while far below, in the oceans of Kepri, the Lirren watched unfamiliar stars shift in the sky and felt, for the first time in their history, that someone strong had chosen to stand in front of them instead of above them, and the galaxy, watching through 1,000 hidden sensors, began to understand that this was not a simple skirmish. not a border incident, but the opening note of a much larger reckoning, because the humans had arrived not as conquerors, not as victims, but as guardians, and the Vanguard had only just begun to show what that truly meant. The shock that rippled through the Zha'thor Armada did not come from the loss of ships alone, but from the manner of it. Because empires understood destruction, they respected firepower and accepted casualties as the price of dominance. Yet what the humans had done was worse in a way the Zha'thor command struggled to articulate. They had reached into the Armada and turned it off, and as disabled cruisers drifted helplessly, their crews alive and broadcasting frantic status reports. The remaining Zha'thor vessels broke formation in confusion, some pulling back instinctively, others surging forward in rage. And it was in that disorder that the human Vanguard revealed its second lesson, because human doctrine had never relied on a single decisive blow, but on layered inevitability. And while the main Vanguard ships advanced with steady, unhurried confidence, smaller human craft attached and slipped through space on vectors that Zha'thor sensors struggled to track, not because they were invisible, but because they did not move the way Zha'thor predictive models expected, accelerating, decelerating, altering course in ways that seemed inefficient until one realized those patterns were designed to exploit reaction lag in organic command structures. And on the Zha'thor flagship, High Admiral Krextal watched his tactical displays degrade into chaos as reports piled up faster than his officers could process them, weapons misfiring, targeting locks failing, entire wings losing cohesion. And for the first time in his long career, he felt something dangerously close to fear, not the sharp fear of imminent death, but the cold realization that he was fighting an opponent who had already anticipated his decisions. And as he ordered a general assault, hoping to overwhelm the humans with sheer mass, the Vanguard responded by splitting its focus, some ships engaging directly, while others redirected power into electronic warfare, so subtle it barely registered as an attack. Because human engineers had learned long ago that the fastest way to win a fight was to make sure the other side could no longer coordinate. And across the Armada, Zha'thor captains found themselves isolated, their long-range comms flooded with noise that sounded almost like echoes of their own transmissions, twisted just enough to sow doubt. While closer in, human ships demonstrated a brutal efficiency in close engagement, not chasing kills, not indulging in spectacle, but neutralizing threats. With surgical strikes that targeted propulsion weapons arrays and command nodes in rapid succession, and each neutralized ship added to the growing field of drifting metal that now surrounded Kepri like a graveyard in waiting. And through it all, the humans continued to broadcast the same simple message: withdraw, stand down, leave the system. And that consistency unsettled the Zha'thor more than any taunt could have, because it suggested that this outcome had been anticipated and accounted for. That escalation was not something the humans feared, but something that already priced in. And as the battle unfolded, observers across the galaxy tuned in, some out of professional curiosity, others out of disbelief, because the human Vanguard did not behave like a conquering force or a desperate defender. It behaved like an institution doing its job, methodical, restrained, and relentless. And on Earth, far from a battlefield, analysts watched the same feeds with grim focus, aware that every move here would echo through diplomatic halls and border disputes for generations, while in the depths of the Kepri oceans, Lirren leaders gathered in trembling silence as human liaison officers maintained calm communication links, explaining in gentle terms what was happening above, reassuring them that the threat was being handled, and those words carried a weight no grand speech ever could, because they were backed by visible action. And when at last Krextal realized that his Armada could not break through, could not regroup, and could not even retreat without human permission, he understood the final insult of the situation, that the humans had not come to destroy the Zha'thor. They had come to stop them, and that distinction mattered deeply in a galaxy built on domination, because it meant the rules were changing, and the Zha'thor were learning that lesson the hard way, surrounded by silent human ships that advanced steadily, patiently, like a closing horizon. As the encirclement tightened, High Admiral Krextal attempted the last refuge of failing powers, appealing to precedent and status, ordering a transmission to the nearest galactic relay accusing humanity of unlawful interference, piracy, and aggression. And the irony of that claim was not lost on the watching galaxy, because every sensor record showed the Zha'thor firing first. Yet Krextal clung to the hope that bureaucracy might do what weapons could not: stall the humans, force them into talks by time, but the Vanguard did not slow, and when a response came, it was not from a council or a lawyer, but from Bennett herself. Calmly acknowledging the transmission and stating that the Vanguard had logged the complaint and would continue operations until the Lirren system was secure, a phrasing so precise it made several neutral observers uneasy, because it implied an endpoint already defined by human standards, not galactic ones, and as the Zha'thor flagship attempted to power its primary jump drive in a desperate bid to break free, a human vessel slid into position with a movement so smooth it looked almost casual, releasing a focused burst that collapsed the drive's containment field without damaging the hull, leaving the flagship stranded and intact. And on Krextal's bridge, silence fell as officers realized escape was no longer an option, only surrender or annihilation. And even annihilation was no longer in their control, because the humans were choosing not to do it, and that choice weighed heavier than any threat. While across the battlefield, human ships continued their disciplined advance, shepherding disabled Zha'thor vessels into stable orbits away from the planet, preventing debris from falling toward the Lirren world, a detail that did not go unnoticed by engineers and strategists watching from afar, because it revealed a level of planning that accounted not just for victory, but for aftermath, and that, more than raw power, unsettled the old powers of the galaxy, and on the Lirren homeworld. Fear slowly gave way to awe as human signals replaced Zha'thor broadcasts, offering status updates, evacuation assistance if needed, and assurances that no human weapons would be fired planetward, and elders who had expected annihilation found themselves witnessing restraint on a scale they had never imagined. While within the Vanguard, captains executed their orders of professional calm, aware that this restraint was not mercy born of weakness, but a strategic choice rooted in hard history, because humanity had learned that wiping out enemies created legends and grudges, while stopping them and leaving them alive created witnesses. And as the last organized Zha'thor resistance flickered and died, Bennett authorized a system-wide ceasefire under human terms, freezing the battle in place. And when Krextal finally opened a channel to surrender, his voice stripped of arrogance, the galaxy listened closely, because the words he spoke were not of defiance or rage, but of recognition, an admission that the Zha'thor had misjudged humanity and underestimated the meaning of protection. And Bennett accepted the surrender without ceremony, outlining the conditions with crisp clarity. Immediate withdrawal from Kepri-1 ships were stabilized, reparations to the Lirren, and formal acknowledgement of human protective status, filed with all major councils. And there was no triumph in her tone, only finality. And as the human Vanguard held position, silent and unyielding, the wider galaxy began to shift its internal calculus, because this encounter had not ended with worlds burning or empires toppled. It ended with a simple, terrifying truth made undeniable, that when humans chose to stand between the powerful and the vulnerable, they did not flinch, they did not boast, and they did not stop halfway, and the age of assuming otherwise was coming to a very abrupt end. In the days that followed the ceasefire, the Kepri system became the most watched patch of space in the spiral, not because of explosions or dramatic pursuits, but because of what did not happen. There were no reprisals, no summary executions, no triumphal declarations, only the steady, almost mundane work containment and transition, as human engineering crews moved among disabled Zha'thor ships restoring life support, stabilizing reactors, and guiding them one by one toward controlled jump points under Vanguard supervision, a process that quietly dismantled centuries of Zha'thor myth-making about their own invincibility, because every restored system was another reminder that the humans could have let them die and chose not to, and that choice gnawed at Zha'thor officers far more than defeat ever could, while on Kepri itself, human diplomats and relief teams made planetfall with careful respect, adapting their equipment to the Lirren's aquatic cities, speaking slowly, listening, more than they talked, and refusing ceremonial honors with an ease that confused and disarmed the locals. And as Lirren children gathered to watch human envoys move through transparent corridors in neutral buoyancy suits, elders realized that the stories told about humanity as a loud and aggressive species were incomplete at best, because these humans carried themselves like people who knew exactly how dangerous they could be and therefore did not need to prove it. And that quiet confidence spread through Lirren society like a tide, replacing fear with a cautious hope, while beyond the system, emergency sessions of multiple councils convened, their chambers buzzing with analysts replaying battle data frame by frame, try to understand how a species so recently dismissed as regionally relevant had executed a multi-domain operation with such speed and control, and the more they studied, the clearer it became that the Vanguard was not an improvisation, but the visible edge of A, doctrine refined over generations, a doctrine that treated war not as a contest of pride, but as a logistical and moral problem to be solved with minimal collateral damage, and that realization unsettled even those powers that had never crossed humanity directly, because it suggested a depth of preparation that went far beyond what treaties and trade agreements implied. And within the Zha'thor hierarchy, the aftermath was brutal in quieter ways, as admirals were recalled, doctrines questioned, and long-held assumptions stripped bare under the harsh light of failure. Because the Armada had not been defeated by superior numbers or exotic weapons alone, but by an opponent who had anticipated their psychology, their decision-making delays, and their cultural blind spots, and as Krextal was escorted home under guard, alive and disgraced, he found that his greatest punishment was becoming the living proof that the Zha'thor could be stopped, and that proof spread faster than any rumor. Carried by merchants, scouts, and diplomats who watched the Vanguard hold the line without flinching and back in the Kepri system, as the last Zha'thor ships departed under supervision. The human Vanguard did not linger for applause or gratitude, their ships repositioned, some remaining on quiet patrol, others slipping back into the deep black where they had come from, leaving behind a reinforced network of sensors, and a standing promise that any future threat would be met just as decisively. And when a Lirren elder asked a human liaison why Earth had intervened so forcefully for a small, unimportant world, the answer came without hesitation, because no one is unimportant once we give our word. And that sentence, recorded and shared across networks, began to change how the galaxy spoke about humanity, not as reckless warriors or naive idealists, but as something more unsettling, a species that treated loyalty as a strategic constant and protection, as a line they would not allow to be crossed. And as stars slowly returned to their normal patterns above Kepri, the universe absorbed a new reality, that the human Vanguard was not an anomaly or a warning shot, but a standing fact. And the next time an Armada set its sights on a defenseless ally, the question would no longer be whether humans would respond, but whether anyone was foolish enough to test them again. The ripples from Kepri spread outward in subtle but unstoppable ways, changing trade routes, alliance calculations, and the quiet language of threat that had long governed the stars. Because every power now had a factor in a variable that did not behave like the others, humanity did not expand aggressively, did not demand tribute, and did not posture for dominance, yet when its word was given became immovable, and that paradox unsettled old empires built on intimidation, as reports, filtered in of border skirmishes abruptly abandoned once human observers arrived, of pirate clans dissolving rather than risk attention, of minor species seeking association with Earth not for protection alone, but for the strange stability that seemed to follow human involvement. And within Earth's own halls there was no celebration, only review, because the Vanguard's action triggered long-planned contingencies, audits of readiness, reassessments of exposure, and quiet reminders sent to commanders that restraint was still the rule, not because humanity feared escalation, but because it understood the cost of becoming what the galaxy already expected. And Admiral Bennett addressed her captains with the same steady tone she had used in battle, emphasizing that Kepri was not a turning point toward conquest, but a reaffirmation of purpose, that the Vanguard existed to prevent catastrophes, not create them. And those words resonated deeply among crews who had grown up on histories of Earth's past wars, where victory often came with ashes and regret, and now they were part of something that felt different, something shaped by memory and hard-earned discipline, while on Zha'thor worlds the political fallout intensified, rival factions seizing on the defeat to challenge old leadership, pointing to the Armada's failure as proof that intimidation without understanding was obsolete. And younger strategists argued fiercely that the humans represented a new category of power, one that could not be managed through fear alone. And as debates raged, the image of disabled Zha'thor ships drifting intact under human control became a symbol of humiliation and warning alike, because it showed domination without annihilation, a kind of victory the Zha'thor had never considered. And among neutral systems, ambassadors began to ask quiet questions about Earth's criteria for protection, about what it took to earn that word. And human diplomats answered carefully, emphasizing cooperation, mutual respect, and a willingness to stand by agreements, And though those answers sounded almost quaint to seasoned negotiators, the memory of Khepri lent them weight, because everyone now understood that behind the polite language stood fleets that moved faster than expected and struck with unnerving precision. And on Khepri itself, life continued, the oceans calming, cities repairing minor damage, and Lirren society adjusting to a new self-image, no longer merely a footnote in galactic records, but a people who had been defended by a power others feared. And that knowledge fostered a quiet confidence, as Lirren leaders invested in education, infrastructure, and cautious outreach, determined to grow into partners worthy of the protection they had received. And when a small Lirren research vessel launched months later, with a human advisory team aboard, it marked not the beginning of dependency but a collaboration, a shared future forged not by conquest, but by trust tested under fire. And as time passed and the immediate drama faded, the deeper lesson of the Khepri incident settled into the collective consciousness of the galaxy, that humanity's greatest strength was not any single weapon or fleet, but a stubborn adherence to principles forged in a violent past. Principles that said some lines mattered, some promises were absolute, and that when those lines were crossed, the response would be calm, overwhelming, and impossible to ignore. And in that understanding, a fragile but genuine shift began, as the stars adjusted to the presence of the species that had learned how to hold power without letting it own them. Years after Khepri, historians would argue about the exact moment the galaxy truly changed, some pointing to the first disabled Zha'thor cruiser, others to the calm acceptance of surrender. But among the Vanguard, there was a quieter understanding that the real shift came later, in the long aftermath, when humanity chose consistency over spectacle, because holding power was harder than demonstrating it. And as Admiral Bennett retired, and new commanders took her place, the doctrine she had upheld, endured, codified not as legend, but as procedure, and the human Vanguard continued its work in the margins of attention, responding to distress calls, escorting evacuations, and occasionally stepping into tense standoffs where a human presence alone was enough to cool tempers. And that predictability became a stabilizing force in a galaxy accustomed to sudden violence, while the Zha'thor, chastened and reorganized, sent envoys to Earth in a move that would have been unthinkable before Khepri, seeking not dominance or concession but understanding. And those early talks were stiff and strained, marked by old pride and fresh scars, yet they proceeded, because even the Zha'thor had learned that ignoring reality was costlier than adapting to it. And as trade agreements slowly replaced saber rattling, younger generations on both sides began to view one another less as enemies and more as cautionary stories, reminders of how quickly arrogance could collapse. And across neutral space, smaller species took note, not rushing to shelter behind humanity, but adjusting their own behavior, realizing that predation carried new risks, and that cooperative frameworks once dismissed as idealistic now had a powerful backer. And within Earth's own population, the events around Khepri became a touchstone, not celebrated with parades, but taught in academies as a case study in restraint, logistics, and moral clarity, emphasizing that the Vanguard's success had depended as much on discipline and preparation as on technology, and that slipping into arrogance would undo everything they had built. And among the Lirren, stories of the battle evolved into cultural memory, not tales of human invincibility, but of human reliability, a subtle but profound distinction, shaping how they approached alliances and governance. And when decades later a distant crisis flared on a far edge of the spiral, involving factions that had never encountered humanity directly, the question debated in council chambers was not whether Earth would intervene, but what conditions would compel it to do so. And that alone marked how far the galaxy had come, because humanity was no longer an unknown quantity or an underestimated upstart. It was a constant factor, steady and unyielding. And as the Vanguard repositioned quietly in response to that new crisis, crews carried with them the institutional memory of Khepri, the understanding that their role was not to dominate the stars, but to ensure that the weak were not crushed simply because they were convenient targets. And in that mission there was no end, only vigilance, because the galaxy would always test its boundaries, and humanity, having learned the cost of chaos the hard way, was prepared to keep standing in the space between threat and victim, not loudly, not proudly, but effectively, again and again, as long as it took. The final lesson of Khepri was not written in treaties or council resolutions, but in behavior, in the way fleets hesitated, in the way threats softened into negotiations, and in the way the human Vanguard became a quiet reference point rather than a spectacle, because over time the galaxy learned that humanity did not seek moments, it sought outcomes. And when a crisis finally erupted years later along a fractured border far from Earth's core interests, involving powers that assumed a Vanguard would remain distant. The response was swift and familiar. Human ships arriving not to conquer territory, but to separate forces, secure civilians, and impose a pause that allowed reason to breathe. And no one was surprised when it worked, because the pattern had been established long ago above the oceans of Kepri, where an Armada had learned that power could be applied without cruelty and strength could coexist with restraint. And in the closing years of that era, scholars and commanders alike came to agree on one simple truth, that humanity's rise had not been marked by empire building or fear-driven expansion, but by a stubborn insistence that some acts would always draw a response, and that insistence reshaped expectations across the stars, reducing the frequency of wars not through intimidation alone, but through credibility earned under pressure. And on Earth, looking back, there was no hunger for monuments or myths, only a sober understanding that vigilance was a responsibility, not a burden to be set down. And as the Vanguard continued its patrols, crews rotating through generations who knew the story of Kepri as history rather than memory, the galaxy settled into a new equilibrium, imperfect but less brutal, anchored by the knowledge that there existed a line that could not be crossed without consequence, and that line was not drawn around human worlds alone, but around any who stood under humanity's word. And in that enduring commitment, the true victory was found, not in the defeat of an armada, but in the creation of a future where fewer believed they could win by preying on defenseless, because somewhere out there, steady and watching, was a human vanguard, and it had already proven exactly what it would do.